In just 34 pages, federal Judge Katherine Polk Failla destroyed Trump's immigration threats and handed Zohran Mamdani the most decisive constitutional victory of his young administration. The ruling didn't just protect New York's sanctuary city policies, it established legal precedent that could shield every American city from federal immigration overreach. But Trump's response was swift and vicious. Activist judges protecting communist mayors won't stop us from securing America. What did Judge Failla write that made constitutional law experts call it the most important federalism ruling since the Civil Rights era? December 3, 2025, 2:47 p.m. Eastern, Room 506 of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan was packed with reporters, lawyers, and immigration advocates waiting for what would become the most significant constitutional ruling of the Trump administration's second term. Federal Judge Katherine Polk Failla, an Obama appointee with an impeccable record on constitutional law, was about to deliver a verdict that would define the relationship between federal immigration enforcement and local democracy for decades to come. The case was formally titled City of New York v. Trump Administration, but everyone understood the real stakes: whether the President of the United States could weaponize immigration enforcement to punish cities for Democratic election results he disagreed with. 3 weeks earlier, on November 12th, Trump had escalated his war against Mayor Zohran Mamdani with the most extreme federal overreach in modern American history. The president didn't just threaten to cut federal funding, he announced plans to deploy ICE agents to New York City with explicit orders to arrest undocumented immigrants at schools, hospitals, and churches. The directive was unprecedented. Previous administrations had avoided enforcement at sensitive locations, recognizing that immigration raids at schools and hospitals created humanitarian crises and undermined public safety. Trump was deliberately targeting the most vulnerable locations to maximize fear and political pressure. Sanctuary cities that protect criminal aliens will face federal enforcement wherever necessary, Trump declared at a rally in Florida. If communist Mayor Zohran Mamdani wants to harbor criminals, he'll deal with ICE agents at every corner, every school, every hospital in his communist city. The threat was designed to force Mamdani into an impossible choice: abandon sanctuary city protections or watch ICE raids terrorize immigrant communities throughout New York. Trump was betting that political pressure would force Mamdani to capitulate where constitutional arguments had failed. But Trump had made a fatal miscalculation. He was threatening a mayor who happened to be a constitutional law expert with the best legal team in municipal government. Within 48 hours of Trump's announcement, New York City filed an emergency motion in federal court, seeking a temporary restraining order against ICE enforcement at sensitive locations. The legal brief was a masterpiece of constitutional analysis, written by Corporation Counsel Sylvia Hines-Radix, with input from Columbia Law School's most respected constitutional scholars. The city's argument was sophisticated and devastating. Federal immigration law explicitly recognized state and local authority over schools, hospitals, and religious institutions. The Supreme Court had repeatedly affirmed that federal agencies couldn't commandeer local resources or override local authority in traditionally local functions. Most importantly, Trump's threatened raids violated the constitutional principle that federal enforcement couldn't be weaponized for political retaliation against Democratic election results. The Trump administration's response was legally weak and politically desperate. Justice Department lawyers argued that immigration enforcement was exclusively federal authority that couldn't be limited by local preferences or federal court oversight. But the government's brief revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional federalism. Immigration enforcement was indeed federal authority, but it had to be exercised within constitutional constraints that protected state and local sovereignty. On November 20th, Judge Failla heard oral arguments in a packed courtroom that felt more like a constitutional convention than a legal proceeding. The stakes were so high that constitutional law professors from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia attended to witness what they knew would be historic litigation. New York City was represented by Corporation Counsel Sylvia Hines-Radix, a brilliant lawyer who'd spent her career defending municipal authority against federal overreach. Her opening argument was crisp and devastating. "Your Honor, the Trump administration is asking this court to authorize political retaliation disguised as immigration enforcement. The president has explicitly connected ICE raids to his disagreement with New York's Democratic election results. This violates fundamental constitutional principles that protect local democracy from federal intimidation." The Trump administration was represented by Justice Department Attorney Michael Curran, who'd been rushed to New York from Washington with talking points but little understanding of constitutional precedent. Curran's argument revealed the administration's legal desperation. "Your Honor, immigration enforcement is exclusively federal authority. Local preferences cannot override federal law, regardless of how those preferences were democratically expressed. Judge Failla interrupted with the question that would define the entire case. Counselor, does federal immigration authority include the power to retaliate against cities for democratic election results the president disagrees with? Curran's response was telling. Your Honor, the administration's enforcement decisions are based on public safety and national security, not political considerations. But Mr. Curran, Judge Failla continued, the president explicitly connected ICE enforcement to his opposition to Mayor Mamdani's election. How do you reconcile that with your public safety argument? The exchange revealed the fatal flaw in the administration's position. Trump's own statements had made political retaliation the obvious motive for enhanced ICE enforcement, undermining any pretense of legitimate policy justification. Heinz Radix's rebuttal was surgical. Your Honor, the government cannot escape the president's own words. He has explicitly stated that ICE enforcement will increase because he disagrees with New York's mayor. This transforms immigration enforcement into political weapon, which violates every principle of constitutional federalism. The oral arguments lasted 3 hours, but legal observers knew Judge Failla would rule against the Trump administration. The constitutional law was clear, the precedent was overwhelming, and the administration's political motivations were undeniable. What nobody expected was how comprehensive and devastating Judge Failla's ruling would be. On December 3rd, Judge Failla released a 34-page opinion that didn't just stop Trump's ICE raids, it established constitutional framework that would protect local democracy from federal retaliation for generations. The ruling began with a scathing analysis of Trump's political motivations. The president's own statements make clear that enhanced ICE enforcement in New York City is retaliation for Democratic election results he disapproves of. Federal immigration authority, however broad, cannot be weaponized for political punishment of local democracy. Judge Failla's constitutional analysis was comprehensive and scholarly. She cited 2 centuries of Supreme Court precedent establishing that federal authority must be exercised within constitutional constraints that protect state and local sovereignty. The federal government may enforce immigration law, she wrote, but it may not use immigration enforcement to punish cities for exercising democratic self-governance. When immigration enforcement becomes political retaliation, it violates the constitutional principles that protect local democracy from federal intimidation. The most important section of the ruling established broad protection for sensitive locations. Schools, hospitals, and religious institutions serve essential public functions that transcend immigration status. Federal enforcement that undermines these functions violates both constitutional federalism and basic humanitarian principles. But Judge Failla went further than anyone expected. She ruled that Trump's threats violated the First Amendment rights of New York voters who had democratically elected Mamdani. When federal enforcement is explicitly connected to disagreement with local election results, it chills the democratic process itself. Citizens have a constitutional right to elect local leaders without federal retaliation for those democratic choices. The free speech analysis was groundbreaking. Judge Failla had recognized that weaponizing federal enforcement against democratic election results violated the voting rights and political expression of millions of Americans. The remedy was equally comprehensive. Judge Failla issued a permanent injunction barring ICE enforcement at schools, hospitals, and religious institutions throughout New York City. She also prohibited any federal enforcement actions that could be construed as political retaliation for local election results. Most importantly, she ordered the Justice Department to submit monthly reports, ensuring compliance with constitutional constraints on immigration enforcement. The ruling was a complete victory for Mamdani and a devastating defeat for Trump. In 34 pages, Judge Failla had dismantled the administration's immigration strategy and established legal precedent protecting local democracy from federal overreach. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within minutes of the ruling's release, constitutional law experts were calling it one of the most important federalism decisions in decades. Harvard Law School's Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "Judge Failla's ruling brilliantly protects local democracy from federal retaliation. This decision will be studied in constitutional law classes for generations." Yale Law School's Akhil Reed Amar published an immediate analysis. Judge Failla has correctly identified that immigration enforcement cannot be divorced from constitutional constraints. Federal authority, however broad, must respect democratic federalism. Conservative legal scholars were more critical but couldn't dispute the constitutional analysis. George Washington University's Jonathan Turley acknowledged, Judge Failla's reasoning is constitutionally sound even if one disagrees with the policy implications. Immigration advocates were ecstatic. The ruling didn't just protect New York, it established precedent that could shield immigrant communities in every American city from politically motivated enforcement. This ruling protects the constitutional principle that federal enforcement cannot be weaponized against local democracy, said Lee Gallant of the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project. Judge Failla has affirmed that democratic elections matter more than presidential preferences, but the most significant reaction came from other mayors facing similar federal pressure. Within hours, progressive mayors from Los Angeles to Boston were announcing plans to strengthen their own sanctuary policies, emboldened by Judge Failla's constitutional framework. Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell announced expanded sanctuary protections. Judge Failla's ruling confirms that local democracy cannot be intimidated by federal threats. Seattle will not surrender our values to political retaliation. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass strengthened sanctuary policies. We will protect our immigrant communities using every legal tool available, including the constitutional precedent Judge Failla established. The ruling was creating a national movement of cities using constitutional law to resist federal immigration overreach. Judge Failla had given progressive mayors the legal framework to defend their communities and their democratic authority. Trump's response was predictably unhinged. At 4:23 p.m., just 96 minutes after the ruling was released, he posted on Truth Social, activist Obama Judge Katherine Polk Failla is protecting communist Mayor Zohran Mamdani and his criminal alien friends. This is an attack on American sovereignty by the deep state judiciary. The attack on Judge Failla was particularly inappropriate. She was a respected jurist with an impeccable record who'd been confirmed by the Senate with bipartisan support. Trump's personal attacks revealed his inability to distinguish between legal defeat and political opposition. Worse, Trump threatened to appeal the ruling to the Supreme Court while suggesting he might ignore it entirely. We will appeal this ridiculous decision by an activist judge, but we will also continue protecting America from criminal aliens regardless of what communist-loving courts say. The threat to ignore federal court orders was deeply troubling to constitutional scholars. Presidents who disagreed with judicial rulings could appeal them through proper legal channels, but they couldn't simply ignore federal court authority. Trump's suggestion that he might ignore federal court orders is fundamentally anti-constitutional, warned Stanford Law School's Pamela Karlan. Executive defiance of judicial authority would constitute a constitutional crisis of the highest order. Legal experts noted that Trump's attacks on Judge Failla and threats to ignore court orders would likely influence any Supreme Court review. Even conservative justices were reluctant to reward presidential attacks on judicial independence with favorable rulings. Mamdani's response to the ruling was characteristically scholarly and constitutionally grounded. At a 5 p.m. press conference in Lower Manhattan, he stood outside the federal courthouse where Judge Failla had just vindicated his sanctuary city policies. Today, a federal judge affirmed what we've always known: local democracy cannot be intimidated by federal retaliation, Mamdani declared. Judge Failla's ruling protects not just New York's immigrant communities, but the constitutional principle that democratic elections have meaning. Mamdani's statement was carefully crafted to emphasize constitutional principle rather than political victory. This ruling isn't about immigration policy, it's about democratic federalism. It's about whether presidents can punish cities for democratic choices they disagree with. The constitutional framing was strategically brilliant. Mamdani wasn't defending sanctuary cities as immigration policy, he was defending local democracy as constitutional principle. The argument appealed to Americans across the political spectrum who believed in democratic self-governance. President Trump threatened our schools, our hospitals, and our churches because he disagreed with our election results. Mamdani continued. Judge Failla correctly ruled that federal authority cannot be weaponized for political retaliation. The press conference demonstrated Mamdani's sophisticated understanding of constitutional messaging. He was positioning himself as defender of democratic principles rather than partisan politician, making his sanctuary policies seem like natural extension of constitutional governance. International reaction to Judge Failla's ruling was overwhelmingly positive. European allies who'd been concerned about American democratic backsliding saw the decision as evidence that constitutional institutions could still constrain authoritarian impulses. The German Chancellor's office issued a statement. Judge Failla's ruling demonstrates the continued strength of American constitutional democracy and judicial independence. The Canadian Prime Minister tweeted, "Constitutional courts that protect local democracy and vulnerable communities serve essential functions in democratic societies." Even more significantly, the ruling was being studied by constitutional courts worldwide as a model for protecting democratic federalism from authoritarian central governments. The domestic political impact was equally significant. Judge Failla's ruling gave Democratic politicians across the country legal framework for resisting Trump administration overreach, while claiming constitutional high ground. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries announced congressional hearings on federal retaliation against local democracy. Judge Failla's ruling confirms that Trump is abusing federal authority for political revenge. Congress must investigate and prevent such constitutional violations. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer called for legislation protecting cities from federal retaliation. No president should be able to punish Americans for their democratic choices. We need federal law preventing immigration enforcement from being weaponized for political purposes. The ruling was reshaping immigration politics by framing sanctuary policies as constitutional issues rather than immigration preferences. Democrats could now defend sanctuary cities as protecting democratic federalism rather than promoting specific immigration outcomes. But the most important impact was on immigrant communities themselves. Within hours of the ruling, immigrant advocacy organizations were holding celebration rallies across New York City. At a gathering in Corona, Queens, community leader Rosa Martinez spoke for many. Today we can send our children to school without fear that ICE will be waiting outside. Judge Failla protected our families and our community. The relief was palpable in immigrant neighborhoods that had lived in terror since Trump's threats began. Parents who'd considered withdrawing children from school were making plans for normal educational participation. Healthcare workers reported that undocumented immigrants were already returning to hospitals for treatment they'd avoided due to ICE fears. The ruling was having immediate humanitarian impact beyond its legal significance. Religious leaders across denominational lines praised Judge Failla's protection of church sanctuary. No family should fear deportation while seeking spiritual comfort, declared Cardinal Timothy Dolan of the Catholic Archdiocese of New York. The Justice Department's appeal, filed December 10th, revealed the weakness of the Trump administration's constitutional position. Government lawyers argued that immigration enforcement was exclusively federal authority that couldn't be limited by constitutional federalism concerns. But the appeal brief struggled to address Judge Failla's core finding that politically motivated enforcement violated constitutional principles even when underlying federal authority was legitimate. Constitutional law experts predicted the appeal would fail because the Trump administration couldn't escape the president's own statements connecting ICE enforcement to political disagreement with Mamdani's election. The government's appeal faces an insurmountable problem, explained University of Chicago Law School's Aziz Hoque. Trump's explicit political motivations for enhanced enforcement undermine any claim of legitimate policy justification. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals scheduled expedited review for January 2026. But legal observers expected unanimous affirmance of Judge Failla's ruling. The constitutional analysis was too strong and the precedent too clear for successful appeal. Meanwhile, other federal courts were citing Judge Failla's ruling in similar cases, challenging Trump administration immigration overreach. District judges in California, Illinois, and Massachusetts referenced her constitutional framework while ruling against politically motivated enforcement. The ruling was creating national legal movement protecting local democracy from federal retaliation. Judge Failla's precedent was being applied wherever Trump attempted to punish cities for progressive policies. By December 20th, the practical impact of Judge Failla's ruling was undeniable. ICE enforcement in New York had returned to pre-Trump levels, concentrated on individuals with serious criminal records rather than families seeking services at schools and hospitals. Education statistics showed the difference. School attendance in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods had returned to normal levels after dropping 15% during Trump's threat period. Children were returning to classrooms where they belonged rather than hiding at home in fear. Healthcare data was equally positive. Hospital visits by undocumented immigrants had increased 23% after the ruling, suggesting that people were accessing medical care they'd avoided during the enforcement threats. The ruling was having exactly the humanitarian impact Judge Failla had intended. By protecting sensitive locations from immigration enforcement, she'd restored essential services to vulnerable communities while respecting legitimate federal authority. On December 22nd, Trump made his final attempt to undermine Judge Failla's ruling through executive action. He signed an executive order directing federal agencies to maximize immigration enforcement within constitutional constraints established by activist judges. The executive order was legally meaningless. Federal agencies were already bound by Judge Failla's injunction regardless of presidential preferences. But it allowed Trump to claim he was fighting judicial overreach while actually complying with court orders. Constitutional scholars noted the irony. Trump was simultaneously attacking Judge Failla as an activist while grudgingly accepting her constitutional authority. The executive order was political theater disguised as legal resistance. Mamdani's response was characteristically measured. President Trump can issue all the executive orders he wants, but federal judges interpret constitutional law, not politicians. Judge Failla's ruling remains the law of the land. The comment demonstrated Mamdani's sophisticated understanding of constitutional separation of powers. He was positioning himself as defender of judicial authority against executive overreach, further strengthening his constitutional credibility. As 2025 ended, Judge Failla's ruling stood as the most significant constitutional victory against Trump administration overreach. The decision had protected immigrant communities, vindicated local democracy, and established legal precedent that would constrain federal retaliation for generations. Legal historians were already comparing the ruling to landmark federalism decisions like New York v. United States and Prince v. United States cases that established constitutional limits on federal commandeering of state and local authority. Judge Failla's ruling will be remembered as a foundational federalism decision, predicted Northwestern University Law School's Stephen Calabresi. She correctly identified that democratic elections must be protected from federal retaliation, regardless of immigration enforcement authority. The ruling had also elevated Mamdani's national profile as constitutional scholar rather than merely progressive politician. His sophisticated legal arguments and respectful response to judicial authority contrasted sharply with Trump's attacks on judicial independence. Political observers noted that Mamdani was building credibility across ideological lines by demonstrating expertise in constitutional law and respect for judicial process. Even conservatives who disagreed with his policies acknowledged his constitutional competence. On January 1, 2026, as Mamdani was sworn in for his second year as mayor, Judge Failla's ruling remained the defining constitutional victory of his administration. The decision had protected his city's values while establishing legal framework for democratic resistance to authoritarian overreach. The oath of office ceremony took place outside the federal courthouse, where Judge Failla had vindicated constitutional democracy just weeks earlier. The symbolism was intentional and powerful, democracy protected by constitutional law rather than political power. In his inaugural address, Mamdani paid tribute to Judge Failla's constitutional courage. When federal authority threatened local democracy, a federal judge reminded us that constitutional law protects democratic choice. Judge Failla's ruling will inspire constitutional scholars and protect democratic communities for generations. The tribute was politically astute and constitutionally appropriate. Mamdani was honoring judicial independence while claiming constitutional vindication for his administration's policies. Trump had threatened to destroy Mamdani's administration through immigration enforcement. Instead, he provided the constitutional crisis that established Mamdani as serious legal scholar and effective democratic leader. Judge Failla's 34-page ruling had done more than protect New York's sanctuary policies. It had vindicated the principle that constitutional democracy could constrain authoritarian overreach. Federal courts remain bulwarks of constitutional law against executive tyranny. The woman who destroyed Trump's immigration strategy with constitutional scholarship had reminded America that judicial independence remains stronger than presidential intimidation. Democracy protected by law had triumphed over authoritarianism disguised as enforcement. Sometimes the most important battles for democracy happen in federal courtrooms rather than political arenas. Sometimes constitutional law matters more than political power. Sometimes judges appointed by previous presidents protect democratic values from current presidential attacks. Judge Katherine Polk Failla learned those lessons through constitutional scholarship and judicial courage. Her ruling reminded Americans that federal authority must respect constitutional constraints, that democratic elections have constitutional protection, and that judicial independence remains democracy's strongest defense against authoritarian overreach. Trump's latest threat had become Mamdani's greatest constitutional victory. The president who'd promised to crush sanctuary cities had instead strengthened the constitutional law that protected them.